How Nazi Films Tried to Make War Look Beautiful and Failed, April 15, 1934. Leni Riefenstahl's office, Berlin. The 31-year-old filmmaker sat across from Adolf Hitler, reviewing sketches for a propaganda film about the upcoming Nuremberg rally. Hitler wanted beauty, not truth, not reality. Beauty. "The camera must show Germany reborn," he said. "The masses must appear as architecture, human beings transformed into geometry, chaos organized into perfection." Riefenstahl understood immediately. She would create a film that made fascism look like art. War would become ballet. Soldiers would become dancers. Death would disappear entirely. For the next decade, Nazi Germany would produce over 1,200 feature films. More than 40 were blatant propaganda designed to glorify war, demonize enemies, and prepare Germans psychologically for total mobilization. These films deployed cutting-edge cinematography, revolutionary editing techniques, and sophisticated emotional manipulation. They won international awards. They impressed filmmakers worldwide. They pioneered techniques still used today. And they utterly failed to achieve their primary objective. Because you cannot make war beautiful when the reality is corpses stacked in Stalingrad. You cannot glorify sacrifice when German families are starving. You cannot inspire fanatical resistance when your audience is living in bombed-out ruins. This is the story of Nazi propaganda cinema, its technical mastery, its psychological sophistication, its complete strategic failure. Before we examine the films themselves, we must understand the context that created them. Nazi Germany didn't invent propaganda cinema. The Soviet Union had been producing revolutionary films since the 1920s. Eisenstein's Battleship Potemkin demonstrated how montage editing could manipulate emotional response. American films during World War I showed how entertainment could reinforce patriotic messaging. But the Nazis systematized propaganda filmmaking in ways unprecedented in history. In 1933, Joseph Goebbels became Minister for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. His mandate was total control over German cultural production. Every film, every radio broadcast, every newspaper, every poster, every public performance. Goebbels understood something crucial about propaganda. Heavy-handed messaging creates resistance. Audiences recognize obvious manipulation and reject it. But entertainment that subtly reinforces ideology bypasses critical thinking. His strategy: produce films that seemed like entertainment but embedded Nazi values. Of the 1,200 films produced during the Third Reich, only about 100 were obvious propaganda. The rest were comedies, romances, musicals, and dramas. But even these entertainment films promoted Nazi ideals: traditional gender roles, racial purity, devotion to the fatherland, unquestioning obedience to authority. The propaganda was everywhere, but rarely obvious, except when it needed to be. Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will premiered March 28, 1935. The 2-hour film documented the 1934 Nazi Party rally in Nuremberg. More accurately, it created a mythologized version of an event specifically staged for filming. The production scale was unprecedented. 30 cameras, 150 crew members, 6 months of editing, approximately 61 hours of raw footage reduced to 110 minutes. The budget was officially 280,000 Reichsmarks, but Hans Saupert, chief of staff for Nazi treasurer Franz Xaver Schwarz, claimed the actual cost reached 1 million Reichsmarks. The discrepancy came from indirect funding. Construction projects for the rally itself were essentially film production costs. Hitler's name appeared in the opening titles as unofficial executive producer. This wasn't a documentary about a rally. This was a rally designed as raw material for propaganda. Riefenstahl pioneered techniques that revolutionized filmmaking: moving cameras mounted on cars, elevators, and flagpoles, aerial photography from aircraft, long-focus telephoto lenses creating compressed, distorted perspectives, tracking shots following Hitler's motorcade through crowds, low-angle shots making speakers appear monumental, editing synchronized precisely to music composed specifically for the film. The opening sequence remains technically impressive even today. Hitler's aircraft descends through clouds toward Nuremberg. The camera shoots from inside the plane, looking down at the medieval city. Hitler appears to descend from heaven, literally godlike. The symbolism was deliberate. Wagner's music swells. The Führer arrives. The city awakens. Germany is reborn. The film then shows massive gatherings filmed with extraordinary precision. Thousands of stormtroopers marching in perfect formation. The camera captures them from above, reducing individual humans to patterns. Geometric precision. Architecture made flesh. Riefenstahl understood exactly what Hitler wanted: fascism as aesthetic experience, power as beauty, totalitarianism as art. The film won multiple awards: German Film Prize in 1935, Gold Medal at the Venice Biennale, Grand Prix at the 1937 Paris World Exhibition. Hitler praised it as an incomparable glorification of the power and beauty of our movement. But here's the crucial detail that reveals everything. Triumph of the Will was not widely distributed outside Germany. The Nazis made no serious effort to promote it internationally. And inside Germany, it was shown primarily in schools where attendance was mandatory. Why? Because the film didn't actually convert anyone to Nazism. Film historian Richard Taylor noted that Triumph of the Will was not generally used for propaganda purposes inside Nazi Germany. It preached to the converted. Nazis who watched it felt vindicated. But skeptics saw transparent manipulation. Roger Ebert, reviewing the film decades later, wrote, "I doubt that anyone not already a Nazi could be swayed by it." The film's beauty was undeniable. Its effectiveness as propaganda was questionable. This pattern would repeat throughout Nazi cinema. Technical mastery combined with strategic failure. Let's examine the war films specifically designed to glorify combat. Stukas premiered in 1941. Directed by Karl Ritter, the film followed Luftwaffe pilots flying Junkers Ju-87 dive bombers during the Battle of France. The Stuka was Nazi Germany's signature terror weapon in 1940. The aircraft dove toward targets with sirens screaming, creating psychological warfare through sound. Ritter's film attempted to transform this mechanical violence into heroic adventure. The pilots are portrayed as cheerful comrades, joking and singing between missions. They bond like fraternity brothers. They talk about girlfriends back home. They show no fear, only eagerness for combat. The film depicts the bombing of Rotterdam as heroic action. In reality, the Rotterdam bombing killed approximately 900 civilians and destroyed the city centre. It was one of the first terror bombings of World War II. The film shows it as military necessity, executed with precision. The aerial combat footage is technically impressive. Actual combat film integrated with staged sequences. The Stuka diving, bomb falling, target exploding. The rhythm creates visceral excitement, but the film includes something unexpected. Post-traumatic stress disorder. Lieutenant Hans Wild, one of the squadron's top pilots, returns from combat severely wounded. He recovers physically but remains hospitalized, broken and depressed. The doctor can't understand why Wild won't leave his bed. Wild has been traumatized by combat, what we now call PTSD. The solution offered by the film is revealing. Another pilot plays Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries on a gramophone. Wilder listens. The music stirs something in him. He rises from bed, healed by the power of German culture. He returns to his squadron, ready to fight. This sequence unintentionally reveals the facade. Even Nazi propaganda had to acknowledge that war traumatizes soldiers. But rather than examining that reality, the film offers musical therapy and ideological fervor as cure. Stukas grossed 3.18 million Reichsmarks in 7 months, a commercial success. But Goebbels himself had mixed feelings, writing in his diary, "Quite good, with some wonderful air footage, but a typical Ritter production. He cannot lead people, rather too noisy." Even the propaganda minister recognized the film's limitations. Modern film historians are harsher. David Stuart Hull's 1969 overview of Nazi cinema, called Stukas, a film with all his worst vices, blatant propaganda, slapdash production values, crude editing, and a terrible script. The film ends with pilots preparing to bomb England. They sing the Stukas-Lied ecstatically as they fly toward their targets. Always prepared and ready to attack, we the Stukas. Stukas! Stukas! But by the time audiences saw this scene in 1941, the Battle of Britain was lost. The Luftwaffe had failed to defeat the RAF. German pilots were dying in large numbers. The film's triumphant ending rang hollow against reality. This disconnect between cinematic fantasy and battlefield reality would only intensify. Kohlberg represents the ultimate failure of Nazi propaganda cinema. Released January 30th, 1945. Nazi Germany was collapsing. Soviet armies were 100 kilometers from Berlin. Allied bombers destroyed German cities nightly. Food shortages caused widespread starvation. And Joseph Goebbels released a 104-minute epic about Prussian resistance against Napoleon in 1807. The film's budget was staggering, 8.8 million Reichsmarks, the most expensive film in German cinema history up to that point. The production consumed resources desperately needed elsewhere. 187,000 soldiers were diverted from combat to serve as extras. The Wehrmacht provided thousands of uniforms, weapons and horses. Entire villages were evacuated to create authentic 19th century battlefields. 100 railway cars transported salt from the Baltic coast to create artificial snow in summer filming. The plot follows Joachim Nettelbeck, the mayor of Kohlberg, organizing civilian resistance against Napoleon's siege. Despite overwhelming French military power, the townspeople refuse to surrender. They build barricades. They fight street by street. Their courage and sacrifice allegedly forced Napoleon to lift the siege. This was complete fiction. In reality, French forces captured Kohlberg. The siege ended only when a Prussian courier informed attacking forces that a truce had been negotiated elsewhere. Kohlberg's resistance changed nothing strategically. But Goebbels wanted a propaganda message, not historical truth. The message: German civilians can defeat overwhelming military power through fanatical resistance. Never surrender. Fight to the death. Victory comes through will alone. The film was intended to inspire Germany's civilian population as Allied armies invaded. Goebbels ordered special screenings. The premiere occurred simultaneously in Berlin, already under artillery fire, and in the besieged Atlantic fortress of La Rochelle. Soldiers surrounded by Allied forces watched a film about civilians refusing to surrender. The film's technical execution was impressive. Veit Harlan directed with skill. The battle sequences show thousands of extras in coordinated action. The emotional manipulation is sophisticated. Stirring music, heroic speeches, sacrifice glorified. But the film failed completely. Because Germans in early 1945 weren't inspired by fictional heroism. They were starving. They were homeless. They were burying family members. They knew Germany was losing. Kohlberg premiered to audiences more concerned with finding food than watching propaganda. Cinemas screening the film were frequently closed due to air raids. Even when screenings occurred, attendance was sparse. Germans had stopped believing in Nazi mythology. The film's production actively harmed Germany's war effort. The 187,000 soldiers used as extras could have defended the Eastern Front. The resources spent on artificial snow could have bought ammunition. The railway cars transporting salt could have evacuated civilians from combat zones. Goebbels prioritized propaganda over military necessity. The result was an expensive film that convinced nobody while weakening Germany's defensive capacity. Film historian David Welch called Kohlberg the apotheosis of Nazi cinema, not as compliment, but as epitaph. The film represented everything Nazi propaganda aspired to create, and its complete failure to achieve any meaningful impact demonstrated propaganda's limits. You cannot inspire people with beautiful lies when reality contradicts every frame. The systematic failure of Nazi combat films reveals fundamental truths about propaganda's limitations. First, audiences aren't passive receptors. They compare propaganda against lived experience. When films show German soldiers as invincible heroes, but families receive death notifications weekly, the contradiction creates skepticism rather than belief. Second, entertainment propaganda requires escapism. During peacetime or early victory, audiences will accept heroic myths. But during defeat and suffering, audiences want acknowledgement of their reality. Nazi films never showed German defeats, casualties, or failures. This made them comforting fantasies for true believers, but irrelevant to skeptics. Third, propaganda becomes ineffective when contradicted by events. Stuka's glorified Luftwaffe invincibility when the Luftwaffe was losing. Kohlberg inspired resistance when resistance meant civilian death. The timing destroyed any potential effectiveness. Fourth, sophisticated audiences recognize manipulation. Nazi propaganda techniques, emotional music, heroic speeches, beautiful cinematography, were transparent to anyone not already committed to the ideology. Compare Nazi propaganda to Allied approaches. Frank Capra's Why We Fight series, produced for American audiences, took a completely different approach. Capra explicitly acknowledged American soldiers' skepticism. His films explained why the war mattered, using evidence and reason, not pure emotion. He showed enemy atrocities using captured footage, not staged heroics. He acknowledged war's horrors while explaining its necessity. Capra's series was directly inspired by Triumph of the Will. He watched Riefenstahl's film and recognized its power, but he also recognized its vulnerability. Beautiful lies could be countered with ugly truths. Let's examine the specific psychological techniques Nazi films employed. Nazi propaganda films use 7 core manipulation strategies. Strategy 1. Emotional priming. Films opened with stirring music and visual spectacle before delivering any message. This created emotional receptivity. Audiences felt uplifted before thinking critically. Triumph of the Will opens with Hitler descending from clouds like a god. Wagner's music swells. Viewers feel awe before processing what they're seeing. Strategy 2. Repetition through visual motifs. The swastika appears hundreds of times in Triumph of the Will, not as information, but as visual rhythm. The symbol becomes hypnotic through repetition. Marching formations repeat endlessly. Speeches echo similar phrases. The technique creates familiarity and familiarity creates acceptance. Strategy. 3. Dehumanization through scale. Riefenstahl's aerial shots reduce humans to geometric patterns. Individuals disappear into masses. Personal identity vanishes. What remains is the aesthetic pattern. This technique prepares viewers to accept mass mobilization. When humans become patterns, individual suffering becomes invisible. Strategy 4. Musical manipulation. Nazi propaganda films paired specific emotions with specific music, heroism with Wagner, sacrifice with tragic strings, victory with triumphant brass. The music tells viewers what to feel before images show what to think. Audiences respond emotionally before engaging rationally. Strategy 5. False causation. Films show happy Germans, then Hitler speaking, then happy Germans again. The editing implies Hitler causes happiness, but correlation isn't causation. The technique creates false logical connections that bypass critical thinking. Stukas shows pilots laughing, bombing, then laughing again. The implication, combat brings joy. The reality, survivors laugh despite trauma, not because of killing. Strategy. 6. Selective reality. Nazi films never show German defeats, casualties, or suffering. They create a fictional world where Germans always win, enemies always lose, and sacrifice is glorious. This selective editing creates alternative reality. Audiences living in that alternative reality become detached from actual reality, until actual reality intrudes undeniably. Strategy 7. Transferred authority. Films associate Nazi ideology with respected cultural elements. Wagner's music, Germanic mythology, historical heroes, classical architecture. The technique transfers cultural authority to political ideology. If you love German culture, the implication goes, you should support Nazism. The logic is fallacious but emotionally effective. These techniques weren't invented by Nazis. They adapted them from advertising, religious ritual, and earlier propaganda. But they systematized them with unprecedented sophistication. The question becomes, did they work? Measuring propaganda effectiveness is methodologically challenging. We can't conduct controlled experiments on historical populations, but we can examine indirect evidence. Evidence 1. Electoral results. In November 1932, before Hitler took power, the Nazi Party received 33.1% of the vote. After 3 years of total media control, including early propaganda films, the 1936 plebiscite showed 98.8% approval. But this occurred under dictatorship with no free press, no opposition parties, and widespread fear of persecution. The approval proves coercion's effectiveness, not propaganda's persuasiveness. Evidence 2. Internal reports. The SD, the Nazi intelligence service, conducted secret public opinion surveys throughout the war. These reports, never intended for public consumption, reveal the actual state of German morale. They show that propaganda's effectiveness declined sharply as war conditions worsened. By 1943, SD reports note widespread skepticism toward official media. By 1944, reports describe defeatism, even among previously loyal Germans. By 1945, reports document complete collapse of propaganda credibility. Evidence 3. Emigration patterns. Between 1933 and 1939, approximately 280,000 Germans emigrated, largely Jews and political opponents, but thousands of non-Jewish Germans also fled. If propaganda were universally effective, this emigration wouldn't have occurred. The existence of resistance demonstrates propaganda's limits. Evidence 4. Post-war testimony. After Germany's defeat, Allied investigators interviewed thousands of Germans about their wartime beliefs. The testimonies reveal complex responses to propaganda. Some Germans believed completely. Others engaged in what scholars call pragmatic conformity, outward acceptance masking inner doubt. Still others actively resisted mentally while conforming behaviourally for survival. Marion Pritchard, a Holocaust survivor, recalled a conversation that illuminates propaganda's psychological impact. Her friend said, "I know that it was all ridiculous propaganda, but for the first time in my life, I have a sense of them and us, Jews and Gentiles." This reveals propaganda's power and limitations simultaneously. The friend recognized the propaganda as ridiculous, but it still created emotional divisions. Intellectual recognition didn't prevent emotional impact. Evidence 5. Combat performance. If propaganda effectively motivated soldiers, German combat performance should have remained consistent. It didn't. German military effectiveness declined sharply after 1943. Surrender rates increased. Desertion became widespread. The final months saw mass surrenders and collapsed morale. If propaganda worked as intended, this deterioration wouldn't have occurred. The evidence suggests propaganda worked temporarily under specific conditions. Early war years when Germany was winning, propaganda reinforced existing belief. Among true believers, propaganda validated their ideology. In controlled environments, propaganda created conformity through social pressure. But propaganda failed under stress. When reality contradicted the message, people believed reality. When personal experience conflicted with propaganda, experience won. When the stakes became life and death, beautiful lies lost persuasive power. Let's examine specific audience responses to major propaganda films. Triumph of the Will. Reception. The film premiered to Nazi Party faithful who already believed. Domestic German response was respectful but not enthusiastic. Many Germans found it visually impressive but emotionally distant. The film worked as party propaganda for committed Nazis. It failed as mass persuasion for skeptics. International response was mixed. Some critics praised the cinematography while criticizing the ideology. Others recognized it as dangerous propaganda. British and American film censors restricted its distribution. The film's international impact was primarily to alert democracies to Nazi propaganda sophistication. Stuka's reception. The film was commercially successful, grossing 3.18 million Reichsmarks, but success means Germans bought tickets, not that they believed the message. Many viewers treated it as entertainment, not ideology. The aerial combat footage attracted audiences interested in aviation, not necessarily Nazism. Howard K. Smith, an American journalist in Berlin, wrote dismissively, "It was a film about a bunch of obstreperous adolescents who dive-bombed things and people. They bombed everything and everybody. That was all the whole film was." His response suggests the film failed to convey its intended heroic message to critical viewers. Kohlberg, reception. The film's reception reveals propaganda's complete failure under crisis conditions. The premiere occurred in Berlin under artillery fire. Many cinemas couldn't screen it due to bombing damage. Audiences who did attend were distracted by immediate survival concerns. Food shortages, housing destruction, and military defeat made fictional heroism irrelevant. One SD report from February 1945 noted, "The film Kohlberg has been received with indifference by most viewers. Many express that they would prefer factual newsreels showing actual military situation rather than historical dramas." The report reveals that Germans facing imminent defeat wanted truth, not inspiring fiction. Post-war interviews with Germans who saw Kohlberg during its original release consistently describe disconnect between screen fantasy and lived reality. One viewer recalled, "I watched soldiers on screen refusing to surrender, while I knew my brother had surrendered to the Americans the previous week. The contrast was absurd." The ultimate measure of propaganda effectiveness is behavioral change. Did Nazi films make Germans support the war? Did they inspire resistance? Did they prevent defeatism? The evidence says no. German support for the war was highest in 1939 to 1940 during rapid victories. Propaganda films came afterward, reinforcing existing belief, not creating it. As military fortunes reversed, support declined despite intensifying propaganda. By 1944-1945, propaganda had lost credibility entirely. Compare this to Allied propaganda effectiveness. Allied propaganda didn't claim Allied invincibility. It acknowledged difficulties while explaining why victory mattered. It showed enemy atrocities using documentary evidence. It treated audiences as intelligent adults capable of understanding complex arguments. This approach proved more durable. Allied morale remained relatively stable even during defeats. British morale survived the Blitz. American morale survived early Pacific losses. Soviet morale survived catastrophic casualties, not because Allied propaganda was more beautiful, because it was more honest. The Allied counter-propaganda strategy was simple: show Nazi films, then show documentary footage of concentration camps, destroyed cities, and civilian casualties. Let the contrast speak for itself. This approach proved devastatingly effective. In May 1945, American and British film crews documented the liberation of concentration camps. The footage showed emaciated survivors, mass graves, gas chambers, and crematoria. Allied authorities forced German civilians and captured soldiers to watch this footage. Then they screened Nazi propaganda films showing happy, healthy Germans. The juxtaposition was crushing. Germans who had believed propaganda claims faced undeniable evidence of Nazi crimes. The beautiful lies collapsed against ugly truth. George Stevens, the Hollywood director who later won 2 Oscars, served as documentary filmmaker for the Allied forces. He witnessed Nazi propaganda's collapse firsthand. Stevens screened Triumph of the Will in Los Angeles in winter 1941-42. He was so disturbed by its power that he enlisted the same night. Years later, he said, "Watching the movie, I realized that all film is propaganda, but Stevens also created the counter-propaganda. His documentary footage from concentration camp liberations became part of the Nazi plan, used as evidence at Nuremberg trials. The prosecution strategy was simple: show Nazi propaganda glorifying the regime, then show documentary evidence of what that regime actually did. Let juries compare promise against reality. The Nuremberg trials used Nazi propaganda films as evidence. Prosecutors screened Triumph of the Will to demonstrate premeditated aggression. They showed Stukas to illustrate glorification of terror bombing. They used the films to link individual defendants with the regime's crimes. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy who appeared prominently in Triumph of the Will, pretended to suffer from amnesia during his trial. Prosecutors screened the film showing him giving speeches to 700,000 Nazi supporters. His memory suddenly improved. The irony was complete. Films designed to glorify Nazism became evidence of Nazi crimes. Films meant to inspire fanatical loyalty became prosecutor exhibits. Films intended to make war beautiful became documentation of war crimes. Riefenstahl herself was imprisoned for 4 years after the war. She spent decades claiming her films were art, not propaganda. She insisted she had no knowledge of Nazi atrocities. She portrayed herself as an apolitical artist exploited by the regime. This defense was unconvincing. She accepted Hitler's personal commission for Triumph of the Will. She received unlimited resources and artistic freedom. She was reimbursed by the Nazi Party for all film expenditures. She filmed Hitler's triumphal entry into Warsaw weeks after witnessing the execution of Polish civilians. In September 1939, Riefenstahl accompanied German troops into Poland. Near the town of Konski, she witnessed Wehrmacht soldiers executing Polish civilians in retaliation for partisan activity. She was horrified. She claimed to have made a personal appeal to Hitler against such violence. But weeks later, she filmed Hitler's victory parade in Warsaw. Whatever doubts she experienced didn't stop her from continuing to serve Nazi propaganda purposes. Whatever her intentions, her art served totalitarianism. The beauty she created glorified horror. The aesthetic perfection she achieved masked genocidal reality. Post-war film scholars have debated whether Triumph of the Will is documentary or propaganda. Susan Sontag argued in 1975, anyone who defends Riefenstahl's films as documentary is being disingenuous. In Triumph of the Will, the document, the image, is no longer simply the record of reality. Reality has been constructed to serve the image. This is the key insight. Nazi propaganda films weren't documenting events. They were creating fictional realities designed to replace actual reality in viewers' minds. The technique worked temporarily. But reality always reasserts itself. By 1945, no German believed the cinematic myths. They believed the evidence of their eyes: destroyed cities, dead relatives, invading armies, total defeat. The beautiful lies had failed completely. The legacy of Nazi propaganda films extends far beyond their original purpose. They remain studied as technical achievements. Riefenstahl's cinematography influenced action films, music videos, and sports broadcasts. Her tracking shots and low-angle heroic compositions became standard techniques. But they're also studied as warnings about how aesthetics can serve evil, how beauty can mask horror, how technical mastery can be deployed for monstrous purposes. Let's examine the specific technical innovations these films introduced. Riefenstahl pioneered the moving camera as emotional tool. Before Triumph of the Will, cameras were generally static or moved on simple tracks. Riefenstahl mounted cameras on elevators, ascending flagpoles. She attached cameras to cars following Hitler's motorcade. She used cameras on rolling platforms, tracking alongside marching troops. Each camera movement had emotional purpose. Ascending shots created feelings of elevation and transcendence. Tracking shots created intimacy with subjects. Circling shots suggested enclosure and unity. Modern filmmakers use identical techniques. Sports broadcasts use tracking cameras following athletes. Action films use ascending shots during heroic moments. Music videos use circling cameras to create intimacy. The techniques themselves are neutral. Their moral character comes from their application. Riefenstahl also revolutionized telephoto lens use. Long focus lenses compress spatial depth, making distant objects appear closer. This creates distorted perspective, where massed formations appear more densely packed than reality. In Triumph of the Will, telephoto shots make crowds appear impossibly dense. Thousands of people compressed into visual patterns. The effect is simultaneously impressive and dehumanizing. Modern stadium concerts use identical techniques. Telephoto shots make audiences appear larger and more engaged. The manipulation serves commercial, not ideological, purposes. But the technique remains the same. Riefenstahl pioneered aerial cinematography for dramatic purpose. She filmed from aircraft, creating God's eye perspectives. The technique made human activities appear as abstract patterns. Individual identity disappeared into geometric forms. Modern filmmakers use drones to achieve similar effects. Aerial shots are now standard in action films, documentaries, and advertisements. The technique has become so common we barely notice it, but Riefenstahl introduced it as propaganda tool. Most significantly, Riefenstahl revolutionized editing synchronized to music. Before Triumph of the Will, film editing followed action logic. Cut when action changed. Cut to show new information. Cut to advance narrative. Riefenstahl cut to musical rhythm. Shots changed on musical beats. Visual rhythm matched musical rhythm. The synchronization bypassed conscious processing, creating direct emotional response. This technique now dominates film editing. Action sequences cut to music, montages synchronize image and sound. Music videos make synchronization their primary aesthetic. Again, the technique is neutral. Its origins in propaganda cinema don't make it inherently evil, but understanding those origins helps us recognize when we're being manipulated. In today's Germany, most Nazi propaganda films are classified as Vorbehaltsfilm, controlled films. They cannot be freely distributed. They can be shown only for educational purposes with proper historical context. The Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau Foundation controls the rights, ensuring films aren't used to promote neo-Nazi ideology. Triumph of the Will is not banned in Germany. In 2018, the Federal Review Board for Media Harmful to Young Persons rejected an application to restrict it further, acknowledging its high art historical value. But Transit Film, the rights holder, exercises copyright aggressively to prevent unauthorized screenings. This creates legal and ethical complexity. The films are historical documents. They're culturally significant. They're technically influential. But they're also dangerous. They still possess aesthetic power. They can still seduce vulnerable viewers. They can still inspire extremism. The solution isn't censorship. The solution is context. Screening Triumph of the Will in film school with critical analysis. Appropriate. Screening Triumph of the Will at a neo-Nazi gathering. Dangerous. The difference is framing and intent. The films exist in legal and ethical limbo. They're historically important. They're technically impressive. They're morally reprehensible. They document crimes. They beautify atrocities. How should we engage with them? The answer lies in context. Screening Triumph of the Will without explaining its propaganda purpose is dangerous. Showing Stukas as simply an aviation film ignores its ideological function. Watching Kohlberg as historical drama misses its role as desperate delusion. But examining these films critically reveals how propaganda works, how emotional manipulation bypasses reason, how aesthetic beauty can seduce audiences, how entertainment can normalize extremism. These lessons remain relevant. Modern propaganda uses the same techniques: emotional appeals over logical arguments, beautiful imagery masking ugly realities, entertainment embedding ideology, repetition creating acceptance. Nazi films pioneered these methods with unprecedented sophistication. Understanding how they worked and why they ultimately failed provides immunity against similar manipulation. Let's examine modern propaganda that employs similar techniques. State-sponsored media in authoritarian countries uses identical strategies: stirring music accompanying leader imagery, crowds organized into aesthetic patterns, military power displayed as choreographed spectacle, individual citizens disappearing into collective formations. The specific ideology differs, but the techniques remain constant. Political campaign advertising uses similar manipulation. emotional music, selective editing, beautiful imagery divorced from policy substance, repetition of slogans, association of candidates with respected symbols. Again, the techniques aren't inherently evil, but recognizing them helps audiences think critically. Social media propaganda has adapted these techniques for digital distribution. Short video clips with emotional music, rapid editing that bypasses critical processing, beautiful imagery masking questionable claims, repetition through algorithmic amplification. The medium has changed. The manipulation strategies remain familiar. Understanding Nazi propaganda helps us recognize modern manipulation, not because modern propaganda is Nazi, but because Nazi propagandists systematized techniques that remain psychologically effective. The fundamental failure of Nazi propaganda cinema came from a misunderstanding of human nature. The Nazis believed beautiful lies could override experienced reality. They believed aesthetic perfection could make people accept totalitarianism. They believed cinematic mythology could inspire fanatical resistance even in defeat. They were wrong. Humans are resilient truth seekers. We compare what we're told against what we experience. We recognize manipulation when it conflicts with reality. We reject beautiful lies when we're living through ugly truths. This resilience has limits. Propaganda can work temporarily. It can reinforce existing beliefs. It can create social pressure for conformity. It can manipulate emotions effectively. But it cannot indefinitely suppress reality. When lies clash with lived experience, reality eventually wins. This is propaganda's ultimate limitation. Not that it's ineffective. It clearly has power. But that its power has boundaries. Those boundaries are defined by reality, experience, and human critical thinking. Let's examine specific case studies of how Nazi propaganda films failed. Case Study 1, Stukas and Luftwaffe Moral. Stukas premiered June 27, 1941, just 5 days after Germany invaded the Soviet Union. The film was meant to glorify dive bomber pilots and maintain public enthusiasm for the Luftwaffe. The timing seemed perfect. Germany had just defeated France. The Battle of Britain was ongoing. Military momentum favoured Germany. But the film's impact was undermined by operational reality. Stukas were vulnerable to modern fighters. The RAF had proven this during the Battle of Britain. German pilots knew their aircraft were obsolete. They watched comrades die in machines the film portrayed as invincible. One German pilot, writing home in July 1941, described watching Stukas on leave. "The film shows us winning easily, but I've lost 3 friends in 2 weeks. The machines are slow, vulnerable. The film is comforting fiction for civilians, not reality for pilots." By 1942, the Stuka was being withdrawn from frontline service against modern air defences. The film's triumphant narrative had been contradicted by combat statistics. Case Study 2, Kohlberg and Civilian Morale. Kohlberg was specifically designed to inspire German civilians to resist Allied invasion. The release was timed for January 1945, when Soviet armies approached German borders. Goebbels wanted Germans to fight like the citizens of Kohlberg had supposedly fought against Napoleon. The film failed catastrophically, not because Germans didn't see it, but because those who did see it rejected its message. SD reports from February 1945 document widespread negative reactions. One report notes, "Viewers increasingly reject historical dramas showing heroic resistance. Many express that they want accurate information about actual military situation, not historical analogies." Another report describes a cinema screening in Hamburg. During the scene where Kohlberg's mayor calls for total resistance, Several audience members laughed. When questioned, one stated, "The French left Kolberg after a truce was signed elsewhere. That's not victory through resistance. That's survival through diplomacy." The historical accuracy mattered to audiences facing invasion. They wanted realistic assessment of options, not inspiring mythology. Case Study 3, Triumph of the Will and International Response. Triumph of the Will was intended partly for international audiences. The Nazis wanted to demonstrate German strength and unity to foreign governments. The film would show potential enemies that Germany was powerful and disciplined, but international screenings often produced opposite effects. British censors restricted the film, recognizing it as dangerous propaganda. American reviewers praised the cinematography, but condemned the ideology. Soviet filmmakers studied it to understand fascist techniques, then created counter-propaganda. The French response was particularly telling. When Triumph of the Will screened in Paris in 1936, French intellectuals and journalists attended. Many wrote scathing reviews recognizing the film's manipulative intent. One French critic wrote, "A technically impressive demonstration of how aesthetics can serve barbarism. We must not be seduced by beautiful images serving ugly purposes." The film may have impressed some international viewers with German organization, but it primarily alerted democracies to Nazi ambitions and methods. It became a warning rather than a demonstration of power. Case Study 4, Documentary Propaganda versus Reality. Nazi newsreels, weekly propaganda films shown before feature films, faced constant credibility problems. The newsreels claimed German victories even during defeats. They showed smiling soldiers even during catastrophic casualties. They depicted abundant food even during rationing. German audiences compared newsreel claims against their own experiences. When newsreels showed German troops advancing in Russia in winter 1942-43, Germans knew their family members were freezing in Stalingrad. When newsreels showed plentiful food supplies, Germans waited in ration lines. When newsreels showed invincible German forces, Germans received casualty notifications. The gap between propaganda and reality destroyed credibility. By 1944, many Germans simply stopped believing anything in official media. One housewife's diary from October 1944 records, "The newsreel showed our victorious troops defending the fatherland. My neighbour's son's body arrived yesterday. He was 17 years old. I don't believe anything they show us anymore." This collapse of credibility meant that even technically excellent propaganda became worthless. If audiences reject the source, the message fails regardless of quality. These case studies reveal propaganda's fundamental vulnerability. It requires credibility to function. Credibility requires consistency between message and reality. When reality contradicts the message, credibility collapses. When credibility collapses, propaganda loses all effectiveness. Nazi propaganda cinema faced this inexorable logic. Early war films had some credibility because Germany was winning. Middle war films had declining credibility as victories became rarer. Late war films had zero credibility because everyone knew Germany was losing. No amount of aesthetic beauty could restore credibility once it was lost. Compare this to Allied propaganda approaches. Allied filmmakers made fundamentally different assumptions about audiences. Frank Capra's Why We Fight series assumed audiences were intelligent skeptics. The films anticipated objections. They provided evidence. They acknowledged complexities. They treated viewers as adults capable of understanding difficult arguments. One episode explicitly addressed American soldiers' skepticism. The narrator says, "You might wonder why we're fighting. That's a fair question. Let me show you the evidence, and you decide. This approach respected audience intelligence. It built credibility by acknowledging doubt. British propaganda took similar approaches. Ministry of Information films avoided obvious propaganda. They showed British sacrifice honestly. They acknowledged setbacks while explaining why perseverance mattered. They used dry humour to diffuse propaganda's inherent pomposity. One British film shows bombed buildings, then a shopkeeper sweeping debris. The narration says simply, "Jerry dropped by last night. We're opening at 9 as usual." The understatement was more powerful than any heroic speech. Soviet propaganda was more heavy-handed, but grounded in reality. Eisenstein's films showed genuine sacrifice. They didn't pretend war was glorious. They showed war as terrible, but necessary. The key difference was honesty. Allied propaganda acknowledged war's horror while explaining its necessity. Nazi propaganda denied war's horror while claiming it was glorious. When audiences experienced war's horror personally, Allied propaganda remained credible. Nazi propaganda lost all credibility. This difference determined which propaganda ultimately succeeded. Nazi films tried to make war look beautiful. They succeeded aesthetically. The cinematography was gorgeous. The editing was masterful. The music was stirring. The visual composition was stunning. But they failed strategically. Because war isn't beautiful. War is corpses in Stalingrad. War is firebombed civilians. War is starving children. War is destroyed cities. War is grief and trauma and loss. No amount of aesthetic perfection changes that reality. The disconnect between propaganda beauty and wartime reality created cognitive dissonance for German audiences. Cognitive dissonance, the psychological discomfort of holding contradictory beliefs, eventually resolves toward truth. When Germans watched beautiful film footage of victorious soldiers, then received death notifications for family members, the contradiction forced resolution. Some Germans resolved dissonance by rejecting reality, doubling down on propaganda belief. But most Germans resolved dissonance by rejecting propaganda, accepting painful reality. By 1945, almost all Germans had chosen reality. The propaganda had become irrelevant. This pattern repeats throughout history. Soviet propaganda collapsed when citizens saw Western prosperity. North Korean propaganda struggles against smuggled information. Chinese propaganda competes with uncontrolled internet content. Every authoritarian regime faces this challenge. Propaganda can control information flow, but it cannot prevent reality from eventually intruding. The lesson applies beyond cinema. It applies to all propaganda in any medium. It reveals fundamental truth about human psychology. We can be deceived temporarily. We can be manipulated emotionally. We can be pressured socially. But we cannot be permanently disconnected from reality. Our senses provide feedback. Our experiences test claims. Our critical thinking evaluates contradictions. Propaganda that aligns with reality can be sustainable. Propaganda that contradicts reality eventually fails. Nazi films contradicted reality fundamentally. They showed war as glorious when war was horrific. They showed Germans as invincible when Germans were dying. They showed victory as inevitable when defeat was approaching. Every claim was contradicted by lived experience. The beautiful lies collapsed against ugly truth. Nazi films tried to make war look beautiful. They succeeded aesthetically. The cinematography was gorgeous. The editing was masterful. The music was stirring. The visual composition was stunning. But they failed strategically. Because war isn't beautiful. War is corpses in Stalingrad. War is firebombed civilians. War is starving children. War is destroyed cities. War is grief and trauma and loss. No amount of aesthetic perfection changes that reality. The disconnect between propaganda beauty and wartime reality created cognitive dissonance for German audiences. Cognitive dissonance, the psychological discomfort of holding contradictory beliefs, eventually resolves toward truth. When Germans watched beautiful film footage of victorious soldiers, then received death notifications for family members, the contradiction forced resolution. Some Germans resolved dissonance by rejecting reality, doubling down on propaganda belief. But most Germans resolved dissonance by rejecting propaganda, accepting painful reality. By 1945, almost all Germans had chosen reality. The propaganda had become irrelevant. This pattern repeats throughout history. Soviet propaganda collapsed when citizens saw Western prosperity. North Korean propaganda struggles against smuggled information. Chinese propaganda competes with uncontrolled internet content. Every authoritarian regime faces this challenge. Propaganda can control information flow, but it cannot prevent reality from eventually intruding. The film's technical innovations survive. Filmmakers still use Riefenstahl's techniques. We see her influence in superhero movies, action films, and concert videos. The formal vocabulary she developed remains part of cinema's language. Zack Snyder's slow-motion action sequences echo Riefenstahl's rhythmic editing. Michael Bay's heroic military imagery uses similar low-angle compositions. Beyoncé's Super Bowl halftime show employed massed formations resembling Triumph of the Will. These modern applications don't carry Nazi ideology. The techniques have been separated from their original purpose. But the resemblance reveals how thoroughly Riefenstahl influenced cinema. Some critics argue we should reject these techniques entirely because of their Nazi origins. Others argue techniques are neutral tools, morally defined by their application. The debate continues. But the reality is that Riefenstahl's formal innovations are now inseparable from cinema's visual language. We cannot uninvent them. We can only use them consciously, aware of their history. But the propaganda purpose failed completely. The films didn't make Germans love war. They didn't inspire fanatical resistance. They didn't prevent Germany's defeat. They didn't even convince skeptical audiences. They remain as warnings. Warnings about the seductive power of aesthetics. Warnings about propaganda's techniques. Warnings about the limits of beautiful lies. In the end, reality always wins. Truth always emerges. No matter how beautiful the propaganda, lived experience overrides cinematic fantasy. The final accounting of Nazi propaganda cinema reveals profound lessons. Lesson 1. Technical excellence doesn't equal moral worth. Triumph of the Will is simultaneously a masterpiece of cinematography and a monument to evil. The film's technical achievement doesn't redeem its purpose. Beauty can serve horror. Art can glorify atrocity. Skill can be deployed for monstrous ends. Lesson 2. Propaganda has inherent limitations. It can reinforce existing belief. It cannot create belief from nothing. It can manipulate short-term emotions. It cannot override long-term reality. It can create social conformity. It cannot change fundamental truth. Lesson 3. Audiences are more sophisticated than propagandists assume. People compare messages against experience. They recognize manipulation when it becomes obvious. They resist lies that contradict lived reality. They ultimately choose truth over comfortable fiction. Lesson 4. Context determines meaning. The same techniques serve different purposes in different contexts. Editing to music can create propaganda or entertainment. Aerial photography can glorify totalitarianism or document landscapes. Low-angle heroic shots can serve fascism or superhero films. The technique itself is neutral. The application determines morality. Lesson 5. History matters. Understanding propaganda's history helps recognize modern manipulation. Nazi films pioneered techniques still used today. Recognizing those techniques helps us think critically. Historical awareness provides immunity against manipulation. Lesson 6. Beautiful lies eventually fail. Propaganda can succeed temporarily under specific conditions, but sustained propaganda requires sustained suppression of reality. Eventually, reality intrudes. Eventually, lies collapse. Eventually, truth emerges. These lessons apply beyond Nazi cinema. They illuminate propaganda generally. They reveal how manipulation works. They demonstrate manipulation's limits. Nazi films tried to make war look beautiful. They created stunning images. They deployed sophisticated techniques. They won international awards. They influenced cinema permanently. And they failed, because you cannot beautify horror. You cannot aestheticize genocide. You cannot make totalitarianism appealing through cinematography. Reality asserts itself. Truth emerges. The lies collapse. That's the lesson of Nazi propaganda cinema. Not that propaganda doesn't work, it clearly does temporarily, but that propaganda has limits. When reality contradicts the message, reality wins. When experience contradicts ideology, experience wins. When truth conflicts with beautiful lies, truth wins. The films remain as historical artifacts. Evidence of what was attempted, documentation of how it failed, warnings for future generations. We watch them now not for propaganda purposes, but for historical understanding. Not to be convinced, but to learn how conviction was attempted. Not to admire their beauty, but to understand how beauty was weaponized. The ultimate irony of Nazi propaganda cinema is this: films designed to glorify Nazism became evidence of Nazi crimes. Films meant to inspire became warnings. Films intended to create belief became lessons in skepticism. Films claiming to show truth became monuments to lies. Every Nazi propaganda film now serves the opposite purpose from its creation. Triumph of the Will doesn't inspire fascism, it warns against it. Stukas doesn't glorify war, it reveals propaganda's techniques. Kohlberg doesn't inspire resistance, it demonstrates delusion's consequences. The films have been transformed by history. Their original meaning has been inverted. What was meant to persuade now educates. What was meant to inspire now warns. What was meant to beautify now reveals. This transformation represents propaganda's ultimate defeat, not just strategic failure during wartime, but permanent transformation into its opposite. Nazi films tried to make war look beautiful. They created aesthetic perfection in service of moral horror. They pioneered techniques still used today. They influenced cinema permanently, and they utterly failed to achieve their strategic objective. Because war isn't beautiful. Totalitarianism isn't art. Genocide can't be aestheticized. Evil can't be made appealing. No matter how skilled the filmmaker, no matter how sophisticated the technique, no matter how stunning the imagery, reality wins, truth wins, humanity's resilience wins. The beautiful lies failed, and that failure is more important than any technical achievement. It proves that propaganda has limits, that humans resist manipulation, that truth ultimately prevails. Nazi films tried to make war look beautiful. They failed, and we are better for that failure, because it proves something essential about human nature. We see through beautiful lies. We recognize manipulation. We choose reality over fantasy, even when the fantasy is gorgeously filmed, even when the lies are aesthetically perfect, even when the propaganda is technically masterful. We see through it. We reject it. We remember it as warning, not inspiration. That's the legacy of Nazi propaganda cinema. Not its technical achievements, not its aesthetic innovations, but its complete strategic failure. A failure that proved humanity's resistance to totalitarian manipulation. A failure that demonstrated truth's ultimate power. A failure that we should never forget, because forgetting would risk repeating. And the beautiful lies must never work again. 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 Never work again.